MGTOW is a personal statement of self-ownership, self-determinism and self as central to gaining improvement and advancement towards one's rational goals to fulfill one's best highest potential. And while each MGTOW determines his preference for how he chooses to live his life, there are corresponding values from which many MGTOW similarly relate. Our experiences are in many ways mutual, and whatever distinctions are manifest, generally are not so distinct as to make our familiar experiences as men and boys within the modern world unrelatable to one another. Perhaps for the first time in modern reckoning, men beyond the political and hierarchical social institutions are finally communicating without the disruptive buffer of some assumed voice of authority, you know, the kind that presumes to speak to our collective experiences, albeit from the least familiar. After all, not all men are upper middle class, white and limited to the ideological range or a frank boy caricature. So as I begin this introductory episode, I should point out that I'm going to speak about a broad range of topics, many of which will be discussed further in later episodes and with greater focus. In a sense, this inaugural episode is something of a basic summary of a personal view. So I suppose it's worth describing and defining a few terms for this view. And since in terms of speaking on MGTOW from a philosophical perspective, the ideology of feminist and feminism cannot be avoided. By now, many of you visiting this channel will no doubt have heard, in detail, and with plenty of commentary, what feminism is, what its representatives believe, not believe, and how feminism has negatively impacted the lives of many men, who until the recent era of social media possessed little or no voice, nor consistent access to mainstream media platforms to discuss feminism's many hypocrisies from which so many men experience feminism as it's currently practiced. To be clear, feminists insist that what feminism is a philosophy and or belief that one of the primary goals of society is the complete achievement of gender equality and social justice. This is to be achieved by dismantling the patriarchy, which they insist is a systemic application within most branches of culture and institutions designed exclusively to oppress women. A few examples of this oppression is in the form of gender roles, rape culture, male privilege, white heterosexual privilege, toxic masculinity, male-on-female domestic violence, the pay gap, objectification of women, sexism, restrictions on access to reproductive choices, and so. Presented in the concise form, the appeal from feminists of basic equality as a reasonable request suggests that anyone who is anti-feminist must by osmosis be anti-equality and therefore not reasonable. And it is from this position, feminism adopts the sense of infallibility from which any critique of others, generally men and male identity, no matter how unreasonable, is not only permissible, but encouraged to the extremes as a form of family empowerment. Even if the critique veers from the legitimate and into the cartoonish, and in contemporary terms, into a narrative whereupon the entirety of male ideas, thoughts, expression, beliefs, character and motivations is reduced into a severe cartoon caricature from which the feminist version of the standard model of man presently persists. By reducing men and male identity into the caricature of rapist, abuser and oppressor, the feminist narrative is also augmented by associating men and male identity with almost wholly negative associations and terminology. Thus you will frequently hear from most feminists that male-oriented aspects like masculinity as toxic, fathers and husbands paired with abuser, pedophile, along with loser, immature, childish, ignorant, and eventually with now predictable certainty, misogynist. That is, unless that man disavows himself from his innate identity and fully accepts the perpetual state of self-loathing, which translates into joining the feminist ideology that demands his allegiance to feminist ideology by spending as much time as possible throwing other men under the bus with the help of a very well-constructed feminist narrative from which extreme oversimplification of men and male identity can only result in conclusions that the primary state of man is essentially rapist, abuser and oppressor. Thus this new feminist man can achieve the preferred status of acceptance within all the so-called social progressives as an honorary woman. It will not occur to him that the feminists actually know little but really nothing about the men whom they build entire careers, in some cases, running into the ground. That men and male identity is far more complex and nuanced, and that men's diversity of thought and mind cannot and should not be reduced to vulgar oversimplifications of which 99% of feminist ideas about men emerge. For the men who are courageous enough to stand up to what feminism has become, these men can fully expect the now deluge of mocking, derisive, scolding condemnation, for which every summary conclusion is the same. He will be finally and abruptly labeled a misogynist no matter how civil or insensitive his rejection of himself as a feminist caricature is expressed. Unless he fully and mindlessly accepts on faith that the only correct way to exist is in equally mindless deference to women's needs, wants, whims and desires as a disposable utility whose rung of virtue is determined by how little he expects or demands equatable reciprocity, by feminist standards he can only be a sexist misogynist without humanity, worth or value. One only needs to read the catalogue of feminist academic literature, observe feminist lectures or read feminist articles to observe within most of them the common running theme of misandry, self-righteousness, and familiar mocking tones when the male gender is a subject. Again and again themes connecting every male endeavor is colored by an express motivation to either sexually exploit women or disenfranchise women with systemic institutional discrimination. Male issues are not recognized within most feminist circles unless those issues are framed in terms that can, like everything else sane current feminist practice, lay blame for his and every other adverse issue squarely at his feet. What you will not find within feminist literature, lecture or article is anything relating to female culpability. In the feminist mind no such thing exists. Any suggestion of female culpability indicating fault or flaw is immediately transferred to something with its origins firmly with men. Whatever she does, from making bad decisions and choices, to lacking qualification in one field or another, is routinely and frequently chalked up to male victim blaming. Thus one achievement of feminism in its long-abandoned quest for gender parity and social justice, is greater entitlements dressed up thinly as rights, is social and political benefits without the complications of personal responsibility, accountability and consequence. And when an entire ideology believes itself infallible and filled with the victims of the oppressed, all other considerations for legitimate issues, like men's issues, or how men and male identity is shaped in criminal terms, can be sneeringly dismissed. Many areas within mainstream media's desire to appease the feminist narrative currently, and with marginally less frequency, with an overabundance of negative male images, from buffoonishly, barely functional loser fathers, to man-child male characters whose inability to grow up constitutes what is supposed to be an innate quality found exclusively within the male identity, to the various parade of psychotics, pedophiles, killers, and sexually perverse animals who we are told can be anyone, but more likely yourselves. The heaping of pathologies to define male masculinity leaves few avenues for positive male images beyond that of the man whose entire life is devoted as a disposable utility to female characters with whom it is clear is under no obligation to express even a modicum of appreciation or gratitude. Time and time again, the independent men in media are the butt of caustic jokes, where even his genital dismemberment is turned into a satisfying source of female laughter, while the most innocuous insensitive comment from a man can likely contribute to the loss of his livelihood and reputation. Indeed, a man may come up with a great idea, invest in the idea, design and build from that idea, accept and take risks where he also accepts full responsibilities, overcome obstacles, and after probably many years of struggle create a grand achievement whose accomplishments usher in the means from which the quality of life may improve for those purchasing the product of his initial idea. And no sooner than this becomes apparent, a feminist comes alone and demands access to the company's highest rungs along with every benefit without ever having dropped a single investment, and in short order demand policy changes to increasingly prohibit access to the men responsible for building the thing in the name of feminist social progress. From marriage to children, from employment opportunities to suicide, to education to entertainment, to the internet to college campuses, there seems nowhere a man may turn that he is not assaulted in 1,000 different varieties, whereupon every aspect of his life is devalued, dismissed, disparaged and mocked. To be born a man within a feminist binocracy is the new original sin from whence his guilt is first assumed and then confirmed with his first independent thought, unsanctioned by the present incarnation of the feminist thought police. Every defense of self is interpreted as evidence of his guilt. Any criticism of subject approved by feminist absolutism is interpreted as proof of his backward thinking, and his likes and preferences, hobbies and motivations not tied to first benefit Western women is proof positive of his childish inability to grow up. And much of his sexual expression is regarded almost exclusively in perverse criminal terms. There is not much left for the modern man now living under a feminist conviction that they and they alone are qualified to define and determine what shapes his lived experiences, even more than the man who actually lives them. So, from any reasonable viewpoint, opting out presents a far better solution for Mencius than the only other alternative of existence as little more than a slave surrounded by gynocentric masters who can't stop articulating their hatred for him, even as they call that hatred a quest for equality. There are many reasons why a man may embrace going his own way. However, for the general feminist observing a man choosing to opt out, it's more important to continue their feminist narrative, which appoints the MGTOW with a loser, childish, misogynist living in his parents' basement seething with resentment, because he cannot date or possess girlfriends or any number of scenarios whereupon his entire choice to become MGTOW hinged on an irrational reactionary model of bitterness from some idea that he must have been rejected by a woman. However, this kind of conclusion is typical in keeping with the general feminist desire to shape the narrative to fit a preferred theme than the realities actually involved. Yet with these qualifiers in place, the feminist on average never has to confront the real underlying issues, the real overlying disparities that contribute to why a man would finally awaken to a deeper understanding of human and societal relationships, whereupon all that remains is departing the field from which the rules for him amount to a zero-sum result. As a partial analogy paraphrasing the book and movie Dune, the reason why women cannot ingest the water of life and become quatadhataracts is because they cannot go where the male mind can. Similarly, the male lived experience encompasses far too many complexities, variation and processes of thought impossible for any feminist to comprehend. It's easier for them to default to oversimplifications, distortions and outright untruths and pass them off as singular authoritative summaries of what determines the totality of man's being. MGTOW disrupts the conventional feminist assessment currently accepted within their academia and present social consciousness by declaring a statement of self-ownership, where self-determination no longer depends upon the underpinning of feminist ideology to give validation to what defines for a MGTOW man his worth, value and most important of all, his humanity.